Everybody live?
Yes.
Yep. Yes.
Okie dokie. So tonight for module number 7, our webinar talks about students with special needs and gifted students. So I'll start off the questions, like I said, with some background. So first question, what federal policies have shaped the educational experiences of students with disabilities/abilities in terms of justice and the law?
Right. Well, I guess the big one is the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. That was that big Supreme Court ruling. And then kind of from there, it went into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which encompasses that zero reject, the non-discriminatory identification, the FAPE, LRE, due process, and then the parental rights as well. And then there's the ADA, and then No Child Left Behind.
Mm-hmm.
Did I miss any?
And there were even a few before that that I don't think I realized until the readings. One was in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which basically said that everybody has the right to education and public education, no matter what their disability. And there was also one that was even before that that just, again, this was during the era of like the Civil Rights Act and other War on Poverty, Pullman Report were some things that I read about that just were focusing on these disadvantaged populations.
Yeah, and it's interesting even now how the law kind of changes with every new court case that comes out. So anytime there's a court case, IDEA changes just a little bit because it's pretty vague. So when you first read it, like all children, equal education, okay, what does that mean? So each different court case is kind of shaping it, which is cool because we're getting a little bit better with our definitions. Yeah. So hopefully that helps.
Something that was shocking to me was in the reading it said that LRE requirement, or least restrictive environment, was the most controversial and like the least understood. But I feel like that's the most important aspect of IDEA, because having the child where they can learn best at all times, I feel like that shouldn't be so controversial. I don't know. It was interesting to me that people are arguing against that.
I wonder if they mean controversial though, like it varies so from student to student, and teachers have their own perspectives or their own opinions on, well, this is what that means to me for this student, but in another classroom, it could look different. Like,
gotcha. I was thinking controversial, like, no, they need to be in the same place all the time. So thanks for clearing that, because like I was like controversial.
Well, I mean, I could see that too, to be honest, because there's a real push for inclusion. So I could see a variety of perspectives, I guess.
Yeah, there was a time where kids with disabilities weren't allowed to go to school. And then when they were allowed to go to school, then they had been removed from the other kids. And so I guess it's just evolving as we go.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting how my school uses a model with like a team teacher for this kind of thing. And it's interesting I feel like the strength of the model works depending on the team teacher you have. Because I've been with some who are like so strong and able to provide that like individualization, and some that couldn't. And I've also seen some teachers who are like, nope, it's your job, not mine. And then like some teachers who are really collaborative in that process. So it seems like sometimes it works really well to have them in that main classroom. And then sometimes I'm almost like, I'll see kids with teachers who aren't really putting in a lot of effort. And I'm like, well, maybe they would be doing better in that other situation where at least people would all be focused on the different needs. So.
Yeah.
And then another thing going off of that, I think I had an interview with my principal, and she said the laws change so fast, and we as educators have to keep updating ourselves and our policies, that it's hard to get to where we need to be and get to where the kids need to be, because everything changes so fast. And she said that's one of the downfalls of special education.
Mm-hmm. And special education teachers, many of them are just so bogged down in the wording and like the little tiny details. And now a lot of people, my school is fairly affluent, and like a lot of the parents bring lawyers to these meetings, and like my friends who are special education teachers with the best intentions are so nervous about like the wrong line, and I love what it's doing for the kids, but yeah, it's getting very legalese, I think, and losing a little bit of the whole point.
So much paperwork, and
Yeah.
Have you guys ever been to an IEP meeting where it lasts for sometimes half a day?
I'm a note taker at those
on meetings where it lasts that long. It's awful.
Debate one little thing for an hour.
Yeah, I've had it go on for 2 weeks. We had an IEP that went on for 2 weeks, and we met every week for like 4 hours because there was an advocate there, and it was all about the LRE actually, and what is the least restrictive environment for that kid. And it was pretty tricky because, I mean, ideally, yeah, you want them in the general education setting, but sometimes the content is so high that there's no way that a kid with an IQ of 45 is going to be able to understand the American Revolution. We kind of have to bring it down a little bit. So it's a big issue right now, especially with the wording being a little bit vague in the law.
And at my school, this Title I school, the resources are so low, and depending on the population of the students, depend on the amount of resources that the teachers have as far as special education teachers. So one special education teacher may be bogged down with a lot of work, and so a lot of times you find that the kids are not receiving the services that they need because the school can't afford the resources. And so everything goes on to the teacher, the content teacher.
Yeah.
Well, let's kind of go on into the next question. What are the different special education categories that educators should be aware of, and what are the differences between them?
Well, I thought it was interesting in the card article. I felt like they actually didn't get the disability categories quite right. So, I mean, according to IDEA and how we identify kids, so there's it's the 13, so autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, and then they use the word mental retardation, which is super outdated now, and it's actually intellectual disability, which was interesting because it was throughout the course they kept saying mental retardation, but a little bit outdated. And then multiple disabilities, which you have to have an intellectual disability to qualify for. And then there's the orthopedic impairment, the other health impairment, the speech language impairment, the specific learning disability, and then the TBI and visual. So those were the 13 that IDEA sponsors. And then they kind of had developmental disabilities in there, and then they put blindness and deafness together, but they're generally all there. So that's what I got.
Yeah. I think it's just important for teachers to realize that there's so much more than just like slow processing. Like, yes, that's a common one, but like you just said, blindness and deafness. I had my first student with a hearing impairment last year, and I meet with like all my kids who have some sort of plan just to kind of see like how they feel about it. And the first thing she told me was, don't treat me like I'm stupid, because everybody would just like act like she couldn't understand, and she just needed to sit near the front of the room. So there's just such a range, you know, that attention deficits don't mean that you can't understand the material, and having autism doesn't mean you can't understand it. It just means you might need it in a different way. So I think teachers need to remember that as they're looking at the different categories.
I'll tell you one thing that blew my mind. I guess that I hadn't thought about it, because the last school I taught at was, I mean, we had a pretty big ELL population, and I had several students who didn't speak English, or at least they didn't speak English in class, but I spoke Spanish, so jokes on them. But that used to be classified as a learning disability, and so many students were tracked that way because they don't speak English and they can't pronounce things the way that they're supposed to. And I just, some of these articles were, like you said, were so outdated. I mean, some of they're 25 years old, and I'm glad to see the perspective there, but at the same time, I'm like,
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and it's interesting because, I mean, there is a focus on classification, but not really when it comes to teaching. Like, I don't teach a kid, oh, they have a label of autism, so I'm going to teach this way. And I think one of the articles touched on that a little bit, but it's interesting that they're so focused on labels for a lot of the articles when really that's not really how the school system works. From what I know, I don't think teachers are like, wait, hold on, what does their IEP say their label is? So I can figure out what to teach them.
yeah.
I think kind of like, how does this kid learn? But I don't know.
Yeah, I guess kind of going off of that, when the question asked about what the differences, what we should do where the differences are, is just like you said, it's just how to accommodate their needs and, of course, following their IEP, but what do they need? How do they need that extra scaffolding, that extra support to succeed?
Yeah.
Because even if they have the same learning disability, or even if two students have some type of communication disorder, I mean, they still are, you still have to create an individual kind of plan for them.
Yeah. I will say the only one that really matters is the emotional disturbance, because if you get labeled with SED, sometimes employers will see that and they don't like to see that. So I think that is a big thing to consider, especially when we're thinking about students of color and students with different cultural backgrounds, is to make sure when we're labeling somebody that we're truly figuring out if it's a manifestation of their disability or what it is before we hit that label, because I do think there's too many kids labeled as emotional disturbance when really it might just be a result of feeling isolated.
Trauma or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have 17 minutes left.
Okay, so what factors are associated with why students of color are disproportionately identified for special education?
What was that question again?
What are factors associated with why students of color are disproportionately identified for special education?
I think that, sorry, go ahead, Amber.
Oh, I think that a lot has to do with behavior, and if we're looking at like the book we're reading for white folks who teach in the hood, it talks about the different things that they value, and so I think like they're protective of their identity, so sometimes they're violent because they want to stand up for like their independence, and they are louder because they like to verbalize things, and so we automatically associate that with like a behavior disorder when really it's just how people are made.
Yeah. I was going to say pretty much the same thing. It's like what we talked about last week, how there's a kind of a set of expectations, and when the children don't align with that, it's like it's got to be them, not us, so therefore there must be something wrong with them. I feel like that's kind of the stereotype. So when students are struggling to conform or struggling to focus, sometimes we assume there's got to be something with them, so I think that they just get labeled a little bit more than they need to, because they can't they can't or won't play the game that's expected, because it's not fair for them to play that game.
Yeah, I'm not sure what this article is called, but it was one of the articles on the module, and it actually like outlined like different behaviors that they noticed from African American students, and then what it sometimes led to them being disclassified. So like movement is that they prefer to have physical learning experiences, but that's misinterpreted as lacking self-control and hyperactivity, or that like people who are unreserved and emotional sometimes get described as an emotional and behavior disorder. So it was really interesting to see all the different things that it was talking about and what is usually connected with.
Well, I think if parents don't know what their role is, I think that this special education is kind of a complex world. And if parents don't know that they have a voice in it and that they have the right to say, no, before you classify my kid as having a disability, we need to go through these steps. And I think sometimes school districts kind of plow them over. So I think that's something that needs to be changed. I think parents need to be given a little bit more power in their kids' education and an understanding of what's happening. And I think it should be a responsibility of the school to hold classes for parents to come in if you have a question about an IEP or what is an IEP, my kid might get classified. And actually, oftentimes the advocates that they send are not unbiased. They actually work for the school districts. So I've had parents that have come to me, like, I talked to this advocate, but they're on the side of the school and they haven't even heard my opinion yet. So I think we need to get unbiased third parties involved when it comes to labeling.
I also think that we need to get the medical professionals involved in a sense that, you know, I as an educator don't know how to classify someone as or hearing impaired or all that kind of stuff, and I don't know what the best way to accommodate them is. So if we have everything working together, where everybody's communicating, like Savannah said, everything will be and smooth for them to succeed in the classroom. So every working piece needs to come together to provide for the best outcome for that student.
I definitely agree with getting medical professionals, because I was in a meeting this year and they pulled out my questionnaire, because I filled out millions of questionnaires for this one little boy, and they pulled out the results and they were like, based on the results of Miss Niggy, it's coming out probable for autism. And just hearing probable for autism was terrifying for me, because it was like, the answers that I gave for that kid made him have that label, and the parents just bursted out with tears, and it was just so hard for me. Like, that is something I'm not trained to be like, you are probable for autism. That is so out of my realm, and I'm being expected to do that. So I definitely agree with bringing in medical professionals.
And it needs to be easier to get that medical label, because I know of parents that have been on the wait list for 8 years trying to see a doctor to get the medical diagnosis of autism, because children are so backed up. Yeah. And there's a lot more resources that open up when you get that medical label, but it's just it seems so difficult, and I don't really understand why. I agree we need more medical professionals in the field.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm also thinking about like for students who are medicated. I mean, obviously I don't believe in like the over medication that happens a lot of times for minor things, but for the students who genuinely need the medication for whatever reason, I had a few students this year who just like sometimes wouldn't take it for whatever reason. And regardless of whether they like severely needed it or not, you're never going to be yourself if you're just like on, off, on, off, on, off. And it's like there was no communication between the nurse and the mom, and like, was it sometimes the mom would tell him not to take it. Sometimes the student would choose not to take it. And it would like cause such a shift in just his demeanor in that class. And so there needs to be more, I wish like the medical diagnosis were clearer with the school. So if we knew he didn't take it, we'd be like, oh no, you need to go to the nurse and take it. Or we could be like, oh no, this is a normal thing. It's okay. Here's how we can deal with it. And we never had information on that. We just made it up as we went pretty much. So.
That's a good point.
But what we've been talking about sort of goes into the next question: what role do educators play in how students are identified for special ed and the types of services that they may or may not receive? So do we have anything else you want to add to that, or Amber, how's our time?
I said one thing. The only thing I think is that RTI, the response to intervention, I think hopefully people are implementing that more, because I think that can prevent a lot of the over-identification for students, because if teachers are truly following response to intervention, we're going to catch the stuff beforehand. There has to be interventions that have been tried. You have to show that your teaching has been changed.
Yeah, it just became state law in Missouri. So this year, every school in Missouri has to be implementing some sort of RTI program. So this is going to be our first year implementing RTI, because we didn't have one before. So I'm really excited to see how it all works out.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like they don't know. Some people are very confused on how to actually implement it and use it. And I feel like that becomes a big issue. I've seen it at several, actually I've been at 4 different schools now, and each one has done something different with it. And it makes you question like, okay, well, which one is doing it correctly? And that makes a huge difference in setting the culture of how to use that correctly in that sense, I feel.
And I'm like a newer educator. I'm going into my 3rd year of teaching. So I'm used to like learning new things quickly. most of my coworkers have been teaching for over 15 years, and I can tell they're overwhelmed and almost terrified about having to implement a new program. So, I mean, I'm lucky because I can learn fast. I just can't imagine like being an older teacher and being thrown RTI because it is a lot, and it's a lot you have to learn, I feel like, beforehand, before implementing. So,
Yeah, I think administration needs to come together a little bit on this because without the proper training, I mean, I'm not a master at RTI. Nobody's a master at RTI. I think the principals and even up higher need to kind of get on the same page because I agree that everyone says, let's do RTI. And then they're like, okay, teachers, do RTI. And then nobody really kind of helps figure out what that means.
Yeah.
So I think there needs to be more training on it for sure.
we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, so let's talk about what is deficit thinking as defined by Dr. Ford in the video, and what are those dangers? Or what are the dangers of deficit thinking?
I think in the video she was referring to the deficits. I see as more excuses that some teachers use of, oh, well, these kids can't do that because of whatever you insert into that spot. So because of their low income, or because, there's no dad in the house, or, they live with grandma or whatever.
Feel guilty of that too.
Yeah.
And teachers focus on what they're missing sometimes instead of like, anytime a student is missing something, there's probably a positive that they're bringing because of that, like that we don't realize. Like the students who are really hands-on, it's like you don't want a dead class where nobody wants to respond or give you responses. So that's instead of looking at like the asset that you could turn that deficit into, it's just focusing on like what they can't do instead of what they can.
Yeah.
Yeah, Donna Ford said in the video, the less we know about someone, the more we make up. So that kind of stuck with me. Like, you don't know something, you kind of fall into stereotypes. So I like that.
It's even like when at the beginning of the year, since we're entering like the back to school time, we in our school we do pink and blue sheets. So the teacher who has the students write everything about them and passes the sheet along to next year's teacher. And so those teachers are already getting preconceived notions about the student based on what was written up about them beforehand. It's like every child deserves that fresh start too. So it's kind of like that, resetting your mind.
Okay, let's almost done here. Next question, what should educators know about the experiences of students of color who are misidentified for special education?
Can you read it one more time? Sorry, Emily.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, it's just a hard question. I was just thinking.
Sorry. What should educators know about the experiences of students of color who are misidentified for special ed?
Well, I think the articles talked a lot about, it was kind of interesting that kids were identified as having mental retardation or mild mental retardation, which I don't really know what that is. But if you convert it over to intellectual disability, I mean, you can't have an intellectual disability unless you also have really low adaptives. So I think what they were trying to say was they are over-identified as a specific learning disability. And I think that can be really hard because if you're at the wrong school and they pull you out too much, you're going to end up missing content and kind of falling back. And that's a problem.
It's also like if students are, one of the few, if they're in the minority already, so they already feel singled out and they're getting pulled out all the time, they just will probably feel more and more singled out and lose that connection they have with school.
And something I thought was kind of, I say interesting, but just the way that some of the assessments are written, one of the articles defined them as Anglo-centric, and I just wondered if that played. I like to think that at least now in 2018, we've made leaps and bounds to where we were 20 years ago. But back in the 90s, how were these questions worded when these students were being tested and some of these articles and research papers were being done? Because if they were phrased in ways that other cultures, other students from different countries, different backgrounds didn't understand, then yeah, they'd score low on it, but that's not an accurate indicator of their abilities or even their IQ or anything like that.
I also just feel like whether they're misplaced or properly placed, like you just need to focus on what they're bringing to the table, because they're bringing so many things, so many experiences, skills, whatever it is. And they've probably spent a lot of time feeling like they're doing something wrong because they're placed in this program, or like they're stupid or whatever, because that's what I feel like my kids who had to go to these meetings would always say. And it's just about like not putting the focus on that. That's not who they are. You know, it's one little piece of it, and finding the things they bring to the table and really encouraging those and like pointing them out whenever you can.
Okay, we'll sort of combine these last two questions. So what factors impact the under-identification of students of color for gifted education? I wrote down two things. In the Writing Forward article, it said two of the biggest things were parent advocacy and teacher identification, and saying, you know, let's look at this child. And if you're in a rural school, or if parents don't have a knowledge of, you know, the things that are available for their kids, then they're not going to know to advocate for it. And I was really sad to see one of the statistics was only from 2016. It said despite high standardized scores, it was more likely for a Black student to be recommended if the teacher was Black. And it talks about these implicit biases that we have, you know, oh, they scored fine, but that kind of hurt my soul a little bit. But
I know for us, gifted education just is not a thing. Like at my school district, I think we have a program, but it's just to get a child into the gifted program, there's just so many hurdles that you have to go through. So I just think, I'm sure that's the same with other school districts that are smaller like mine. Trying to get a student at all into gifted education is a difficult process because of the lack of resources that we have.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that unfortunately, no matter how high students score, teachers are going to struggle to recommend somebody if they feel like they're challenging in the classroom. And we already talked about like the behaviors that some teachers find challenging, even though there's nothing wrong with them per se, they just don't align with what they're used to. So, you know, it's hard for teachers to see past that, unfortunately, and not see those students. Like so many students act out when they're bored, which is hard because then you don't want to recommend them for something higher because they're acting out, but it's because they're bored. So it's like this vicious cycle of you don't want to take that risk and recommend the kid, and then like they act out there too, but that really could be exactly what they need to be challenged enough to stay engaged.
So this kind of wraps up our very last question. What can we as educators do to address the under-identification of students of color for gifted education? And we'll wrap up with that.
I think the biggest thing is just, you know, with anything, early recognition and starting off at the younger ages, building kids up, getting them interested in all aspects of STEM, boys, girls, children of color. I think if I was maybe exposed to more STEM curriculum when I was younger, who knows what I'd be doing now. I could be an engineer, I don't know. But I know, you know, in my elementary school, it was like, oh, girls don't really like math. So like all of the girls were in the younger or in the lower math classes, and all the boys were in the higher ones. And I think that needs to kind of be changed. And I think that's what we're working on changing, but early recognition and then increase in rigor and having high expectations for all kids, not just white students, not just white males, not just white females, but everybody having, you know, high expectations and rigor across the board. I don't know it.
Yes.
Sorry, I lost internet, but I'm back.
Yeah, I totally agree with Savannah. I think just increasing your expectations for all students is extremely important and holding those expectations at all times.
Because it's really
Giving them a
easy
chance.
for us to kind of not dumb it down, but dumb it down. And because I know so many of my students, there's such an achievement gap. It's easy to kind of let it slip. And
Yeah.
I was going to say giving them a chance to show what they know in different ways too, because sometimes it's amazing like what you'll see when you allow someone to express something visually versus verbally. You know, I've tested kids out loud instead of having them write, and like all of a sudden your mind is blown. So not having one way where they get to show that they get something, but having more chances to see that spark and that giftedness or whatever you want to call it.
Absolutely.
True. And I think we as teachers have to be a little bit more cognizant and more aware of what's going on in our classroom, because we're spending so much time on the lower end kids that we're not noticing these minority kids who are gifted. And so we have to be more aware of truly what's going on in the bigger picture.
Yeah, agreed.
And working like as a multidisciplinary team, so having an ELL teacher, having the gen ed teacher, having the special ed teacher, all working together, because I think a lot of times it's like, oh, that's the general education teacher's job. Oh, that's the special education teacher's job. That's the ELL teacher's job. And I think if we can all work together and figure out a way, I mean, obviously we'll need more resources and common planning time, but I think that would be huge in helping all kids succeed.
It's like a true middle school team atmosphere, I guess you would say.
I would just like to add, I agree with Christopher Edmond when I say that I don't think it's just white teachers that teach in the hood. I think it's also minority teachers or teachers of color that become complacent with the traditional teaching in the classrooms. It's not always depending upon the teacher's race of how comfortable or how versatile their teachings are with the students. And I'm guilty of that because, you know, you're told to teach this standard and they're going to be taught this, or to teach them this way because they have an IEP. And after a while, your creativity or your ability to notice a student's ability to do or to go further in the curriculum is kind of hampered. So.
True.
That's all.
all right. Any final thoughts for this almost final?
It was a good talk.
That's good.
Okay, signing off now.